Well, I'm really honored to be here. I have never been on your campus before, but I will admit that I tried to get your college, at that time Elon College, into the CAA athletic conference about 15 years ago. But some of our northern partners at that time didn't want another southern school in the conference, so it didn't work out, but I'm glad that eventually it did. I would have hoped that you had the courtesy not to beat us just before we went to the CAA conference in basketball, but that's the way it goes. Let me just say a word or two about my background because it's relevant to the book. I'm a transplant. I was born in Charleston, South Carolina, but I grew up on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. But I came to Duke University in 1964. And I've been in North Carolina ever since. And one of the reasons that I came to Duke was that I wanted to teach at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And so that worked out successfully. But I came to North Carolina at a time when I think the state was going through, perhaps you'd call it a renaissance or a large progressive leap forward. And because of some of my associations, I went to school at Georgetown and I worked in the United States Senate, and I got to meet Senator B. Everett Jordan, and Senator Jordan insisted that when I came, I had to meet Terry Sanford, the governor of North Carolina. So as a graduate student, I was invited over to meet Terry Sanford, and Terry Sanford was not in a good mood at that time. He had his friend Richardson Pryor had lost the election, and he was literally throwing books across the room. And then he sat down and gave me a little bit of a lecture on North Carolina history and how disappointed he was that the state was not going to continue moving as rapidly in the direction that he wanted. But anyhow, I decided I wanted to live in North Carolina, I wanted to raise my children in North Carolina. I thought that it had everything I wanted, from a beautiful environment to excellent universities to teach and a place to raise my children. And so I've been delightfully happy. I had a lot of students at Chapel Hill, and then I went from Chapel Hill to Hampden-Sydney College, but I got back here as fast as I could and came chancellor of UNCW. And I was there for 13 years. The biggest mistake, perhaps, I made was in 2010, I was inveighed upon to run for the North Carolina State Senate. I lost. I got a few votes, but I lost. And it set me to thinking and trying to figure out, well, why I lost in part was I was a poor candidate. That was one reason that I lost. But there also was a Republican juggernaut that I got run over by. I mean, I felt like a smart car or something that got hit by a 10-ton trailer. I was just blown away, as was the Democratic Party in the 2010 election, and that then has continued through 2012 and 2014. So I decided that I would research what happened. I'm a historian by training, and I would try to look back in North Carolina's history and see if I could find some explanation of what happened and how it happened. So I started researching North Carolina history. I never taught North Carolina history, but I knew Hugh Leffler, who was a legendary historian at Chapel Hill, and so I went to Leffler's book and I went to other books because I didn't want to write a history of North Carolina, but I wanted to try to understand North Carolina. And I found that a couple of interesting things. One was that there had always been a progressive impulse in North Carolina, going back to the 1820s or so, when there was a so-called Whig party, and the Whig party had been a party that favored internal improvements was one of the primary things, roads and bridges and canals and other ways of moving people around. They also favored public education and felt that this was the way for the state to move forward. And the Whigs had held power in North Carolina for a relatively brief time, 15 or 20 years, and then a more traditionalist group came in because the other trend in North Carolina had been a strong traditionalist trend in which the state essentially was run by an aristocracy, a plutocracy. At that time, it was the plutocracy primarily of the plantation owners and of the nascent businesses that were beginning along the fall line of North Carolina, and they called a lot of the shots at what happened. And it was these people who helped lead us into the Civil War. And then there was a brief period after the Civil War that we call Reconstruction, and the Whigs came back during that time. The Whigs were called scallywags because that was a derogatory term for old Whigs who had opposed the people who got us into the war. Now, you run into all these problems with definitions. At that time, the conservatives were the Democrats. The Democrats were the conservatives, and the Republicans were the more progressive. The Republicans were the party of Lincoln at that time, who had opposed secession, and North Carolina was a very close-run thing in 1861, whether North Carolina would secede from the Union, but North Carolina decided it would. But the state was divided during the war, and David Winslow and I are working on the development of North Carolina Civil War Center in Fayetteville, and one of those things that we have found and are illustrating is how close it was in the state. The eastern part of the state was pro-secession, pro-slavery. The western part of the state was anti-secession, anti-slavery. The Raleigh newspaper at that time opposed secession and continued to throughout the war. There was a strong unionist movement during that time. But in any case, the Democrats were the conservatives. The Republicans were the ones who led the way into Reconstruction. And I tend to view Reconstruction as a failed noble experiment. It didn't work. Its time had not come. And in North Carolina, Reconstruction only lasted for a very brief period of time, probably essentially from 1865 at the end of the war until about 1870. It lasts officially until 1876, but it really was over after 4 or 5 years. They impeached the Republican governor, Governor Holden, who had been governor during Reconstruction, and North Carolina went back to sleep. It was traditional to call North Carolina the Rip Van Winkle state. North Carolina was a poor state, a backward state, and it didn't seem to have much ambition. But from 1876 until 1894, the Democrats held power in North Carolina, and by this time there were some burgeoning businesses in North Carolina, and it was those business people, industrialists and others like the James B. Dukes and the Reynolds and others who held the political power and pulled the strings of power in North Carolina. The majority of people were poor, and there was a great gap between the rich and the poor during this period. And I'm still in the latter part of the 19th century. In 1894, a coalition was formed between Republicans and populists, and for 4 years they ran the state. And they tried to turn the state around. They tried to emphasize internal improvements. They tried to emphasize education. They tried to change the tax structure in the state. But they made the signal mistake of enlisting black voters, and this incensed a lot of people in North Carolina. In Wilmington, North Carolina, in 1898, at the next presidential election year, there was a riot, and even people in Wilmington don't know much about the 1898 riot, but there was a riot in Wilmington. There were a number of people killed, and the power was virtually turned over to a new government at the point of a gun. They went into the city hall and dismissed the elected leaders and replaced them with Democratic leaders. They called themselves the Redeemers. They were redeeming the state, back to our magnolia-scented past when things would be better again. And for 50 years, they ran the state with virtually no opposition. That is, there were, once in a while, there would be a Republican elected to power, but by and large, the Democratic redeemers held power in the state of North Carolina until the post-Second World War. That is when there then begins what I had referred to as this renaissance that was led by people like Carr Scott and people like Luther Hodges and then people like Terry Sanford. Now, to give you an idea of how poor North Carolina was at that time, when Luther Hodges became governor of the state in the early 1950s, he found to his shock and surprise that North Carolina was 44th out of 48 states in per capita income. The state was incredibly poor. Let me see if I can quickly find the statistic here. North Carolina lagged in per capita income $1,615 to a U.S. average of $2,254, earning only 71% of the national average. We had twice as many poor people in as the national average and far fewer college graduates. North Carolina had made great strides since World War II, but still had a long way to go. In 1960, almost 700,000 North Carolinians were functionally illiterate. 60,000 had never completed 1 year of school. So North Carolina, now my point here is that we know what a redeemer government can do for you. They can ruin your schools, they can ruin your roads, and they can set the average person back in North Carolina. That's what 50 or 60 years of Redeemer rule did for North Carolina. And this is an opinion. This is the way it was. This is what happened. And this is where I enter in 1964, as I say, and start talking to Terry Sanford and other people who were began talking about things like the Research Triangle, talking about building the reputation of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and and the private schools in North Carolina, and emphasizing good roads. I was always sort of intrigued by the fact that why did people talk about North Carolina or a good roads governor? The reason was the majority of roads in North Carolina in the 1960s were gravel roads. They were not hard surface roads. People were living on dirt roads and gravel roads. They weren't living on hard surface roads. So when some of these governors came in, they wanted to talk improvements, they became good roads governors because that's what they were going to emphasize. As Carr Scott said, we're going to get the farmers out of the mud, out of these mud roads so that they can get their product to the market with their trucks and not get stuck. So we had a renaissance. We did not become as good as you would like us, I would like us to do, but certainly magazines wrote us up as the Dixie Dynamo. North Carolina was a great place to do business. By 2010, North Carolina was 14th. By 2010, that is 50 years after 1960, North Carolina was 14th in per capita income, judged by Forbes magazine the third best place to do business. This is in 2010. So we had made a lot of progress. Our universities and colleges had gotten better. Our roads had gotten better. We had established a better reputation. There was a time when North Carolina compared itself to Mississippi. No longer. North Carolina at this period, in this time, is talking about them comparing themselves to Virginia or to other states that we aspired to be like. Now, how did the Redeemers, and as I say, I struggled with the question of what you call these people. And I want to make the point, I am trying not to be partisan. I really am, because there were, during the period of the 50s and 60s, there were progressive Republicans people like Jim Holshouser, the first Republican governor in the state since Reconstruction. There were people like Jim Martin, who was another progressive Republican governor, who made changes in the way the state did things, but they didn't turn the state radically on its heels. And so I call the folks that are now in power Redeemers. I don't call them Republicans because I don't know and somebody maybe in our question and answer can tell me what happened to the progressive Republicans, the moderate Republicans. I don't know. I really, truly don't know where they went, but they sort of disappeared. Now, how did this happen? How did the Redeemers get and turn the state around politically? Governor McCrory, campaigning in 2010, said the state was broken, that he was going to fix it and the Redeemers were going to fix the state. But as I've already pointed out to you, certainly 14th in per capita income and third place, best place to do business in the country doesn't sound too broken to me. Now, there were things that could have been improved. There was a group called the Progress Board that had been set up by the legislature to measure how the state was doing in a variety of areas. And in some areas, we were doing very well. And in some other areas, we were not doing quite so well. Air quality was a big problem. Child mortality was a big problem. Environmental protection needed to be done better. The tax structure was not as fair as it should have been. So there were things that we knew needed to be fixed in the state. But that is not what the Redeemers took out after. The Redeemers took out after social issues. The guy that ran against me in 2010 ran as the jobs senator. What did he do as far as jobs were concerned once he got in office? Nothing. His signal accomplishment in his first term was to repeal the ban on the Outer Banks against the use of plastic bags. That was a bad thing, and that cost the businesses a lot of money, and therefore you wanted to get rid of plastic bags. Had nothing to do with jobs, by the way. So the economy was suffering, and the political party that ran in 2010 and 2012 convinced the people of North Carolina that that was the fault of the Democratic Party. That's nonsense. This was a much larger issue than the fault of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party had had 2 weak governors. Governor Easley, who got himself in trouble financially, and Governor Perdue, who found the economic situation and other things so daunting and her job of issuing veto after veto so unappetizing that she decided not to run for a second term. And once she announced that and became a lame duck, I think she opened the door to Republican advances. So I think that there were things that were going on in the 2010 period that eased the way for the Redeemers. But as I looked deeper, I found that actually the Redeemer group had been working for over 30 years to bring about the change that occurred in 2010. The architects of the change that took place in 2010 were Jesse Helms and Art Pope. They had been planning since the 1970s and 80s to take over the state, and they had done it patiently. They had done it through the John Locke Foundation, which is a think tank in Raleigh that has all kinds of educational activities as well as political activities that they did. And they also attracted the attention of the Republican National Party. And they got help from the Republican National Party, particularly Ed Gillespie, who had been chairman of the Republican Party, came down to North Carolina in early 2010 and sat down with Art Pope and planned out how they might target certain races in North Carolina in order to take the North Carolina State Senate. It was called the Red State Project, capital R, capital S, the Red State Project. And they targeted certain Senate races, including mine. They were aided by the Citizens United decision that allowed out-of-state money to pour into the state in 2010 in that election. And a lot of money came in from out-of-state that was not matched by the National Democratic Party and certainly was not matched by the State Democratic Party. As far as I was concerned, and as far as many of my companions who were running, the State Democratic Party was AWOL. They were absent. They did nothing. They thought they were going to win because they had always won before and could not imagine that they were not going to win in this case. The Republicans, since the 1970s, had organized things like the Republican State Leadership Committee, which focused on what were called down-ticket races, not the governorship, not the state Senate, not the state House, but other races within the state, including judicial races. And money was poured into the state to win judicial races, but not in 2010, but in 2012. $800,000 came into North Carolina to defeat a state Supreme Court judge in the primary. $800,000 in a primary race for a judicial seat. So the Republicans had, and the Republican National Committee and others had figured out how to do it, and they worked on it long and slow. They had set up things like the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, and others. And what I'm saying is they did a bloody good job. They were organized, they were thoughtful, they figured out what they wanted to do, they targeted it, they were disciplined, and they won. But it took them a long time in order to do it. Now, the other point that I'll make here is that when they did, the newspapers went bananas and said that the Republicans had taken over the state of North Carolina for the first time in 125 years. That was nonsense. These were the Democrats. These were the old Democrats that had taken over the party that had run the state from 1898 until the early 60s. That was the same party and the same policies. Now, what were some of those policies that were practiced by the Redeemers in 1898? Voter suppression was very high on the list. And they rewrote the Constitution of the state of North Carolina to virtually disenfranchise black voters. They did it in a very calculated way. They figured that if they could keep blacks from voting, they could continue winning office. That the margin between white Democrats and white Republicans was narrow, but if they could get rid of all of those black votes, they could win races. They lowered taxes on businesses. They reduced support for public education. They reduced support for infrastructure. Now, I see the Redeemers today doing exactly the same thing. It's like they took a page out of the playbook of the Redeemers of 1898, and that's why I say we're going backward 100 years. And this is a sidebar, but I think something intriguing is happening in the world. The Islamic State wants to go back 700 years. They want to go back to the caliphate of the year 700. And I see happening, not just in this state, and I think that the Republican National Party saw in North Carolina, because of this fine line between, we had a progressive impulse, but we also had a strong conservative impulse. I think they saw North Carolina as a petri dish in which to experiment with taking over a state. And if they could take over a state like North Carolina with its progressive reputation, they could take over a lot of other states. And I think they've used some of the same attitudes and some of the same approaches in doing so. So what needs to be done from my view? I was going to title my book, "I'm Mad as Hell and I Want My State Back." But my editor said that he didn't think that was a good idea, so I didn't title it that. But if the state is to be moved back in a progressive direction, and I return to the point, I don't care who it does, I don't care what the party label is, I don't care whether they're unaffiliated, I don't care whether they're Republicans, I don't care who they are. What needs to be done? For one thing, something has to be done about gerrymandering. The state is now gerrymandered. North Carolina has 3 of the most gerrymandered districts in the entire country, and the 12th district is the most gerrymandered district in the country. Again, the Redeemers did a beautiful job of redistricting and changing the district lines. Very artful use of GPS mapping, and they did a wonderful job. Gerrymandering has hurt the state. And it has protected. When I wondered why the Redeemers didn't move more toward the middle, why they didn't modulate after they got into office, which I thought they were going to do, it is because I think they feel protected both by, and I'm sure someone's going to want to argue with me about this, and I won't argue because I'll just say I believe that the Republicans have practiced voter suppression. I believe that the voter registration laws are primarily aimed to keep students, black people, brown people, and older people from voting. I think that's what I think, and somebody else may think something else. But I think they feel protected in gerrymandered districts. They don't have to move to the middle. They don't have to cater to another group of people because they've got their self-selected voters in their district. But something needs to be done about gerrymandering. It should be done by commission, and it is in some other states. The states are redistricted by gerrymandering. The Democratic Party needs to be reformed. The Democratic Party is not going to win a major election in North Carolina until it both gets itself better organized and until it turns more to talking about economic and pocketbook issues that affect the vast number of North Carolinians. The issue of economic maldistribution of income and the fact that the middle class, since 1985 or so, has stayed static or gone backward is the biggest political issue facing the United States. And I think the Democratic Party needs to address that and make it a major factor of what it does in the elections. But realize that whereas the 2016 election that's coming up is important, 2018 and 2020 are more so, and even when that happens, if the Democrats control the Senate, or the new party, whatever you want to call them, controls the Senate in 2020 and redistricts the state, it won't be until the 2022 election that there's a major change in the political direction of North Carolina. It's not going to happen. It isn't going to be turned around in a single election or an election or two. We need to turn out more voters. The voter turnout in this last election was as low as it had been as any time since World War II. People just don't turn out for midterm elections. They don't think they're important. They don't realize that it's not only the people that you put in Raleigh in the Senate and the House, but that those people appoint things like the Board of Governors, the Insurance Rate Commission, the Coastal Resources Commission. They appoint the commissions that do a lot about running the state of North Carolina. So people have to be turned out and realize that they need to vote. And I'm very disturbed at some of the things that I see happening. I was on the Coastal Resources Commission, and there's always been a balance between the environment and business interests. But I believe that the tilt today is going more for the business interest rather than for the environment, as far as the Coastal Resources Commission is concerned. We need to turn out better candidates, and it's hard to get people to run. And no, I would not run for office again under any circumstances. I learned a lot, but I don't want to learn it again. But we need to turn out young people to run for office. We need to get more younger, energetic people out running for office. We need to re-win the business vote. One of the most dramatic changes to my mind was, whereas I said in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, in that period, business voted progressive, and business put their money behind progressive issues in political and candidates. In 2010, the business community was not there, and they haven't been there behind the Democratic Party and Democratic or non-affiliated candidates. They've either not been there at all, or they have supported the Redeemers. And I don't fully understand why. I'm trying to fathom exactly what happened. But there used to be something, North Carolina Citizens for Business and Industry, that included, I don't know, Dr. Daniel, were you ever on that? I was on and where there were educators and others on the commission, and we talked about business and so on. In 2008, the North Carolina Citizens for Business and Industry went out of business, and it became the North Carolina Chamber of Commerce. And their emphasis is on low regulation and low taxes. Nothing about education. And so we need to re-win the support of the business community. And from the evidence that we have and that I've tried to provide you tonight about how the Redeemers came to power, it takes long, hard, slow work. It may not take us the 40 years that it took the Redeemers, but if we want our state back, we are going to have to work at it very hard in order to have that happen. So let me see. I think I will conclude with the conclusion that I wrote for the book. North Carolina and her people stand at a crossroads. We have been here before. We can either go forward, we can stand still, or we can go backward. In the past, in different eras, we have tried each of these strategies. We know that going forward takes effort, and we have never gotten to be as good a state as we would like to be. We also know what going backward nets us. We are about to find out again unless we reverse course and do it quickly. Voter suppression, low taxes, lax regulation, and poor public schools won't even get you halfway home. Have we lost all ambition? Have we lost our competitive edge? Are we satisfied to be mediocre? Don't we want a better life for those who follow us? Do we want clean air, clean water, tree-capped mountains, and pristine beaches? Or will we surrender to those negative forces that have been in retreat for 50 years? And don't kid yourself, those malignant forces driven by ignorance, intolerance, and mean-spiritedness are now setting a lot of North Carolina's agenda. I am convinced the majority of North Carolina's people, regardless of political affiliation, and even those with no political affiliation, don't want to go back to the Gilded Age of the 1890s, of white supremacy and inequality. And if you think my reference to white supremacy is an exaggeration, look at those in the majority in the North Carolina General Assembly. There is not a black or brown face among them. Although black and brown citizens make up fully 1/3 of our population, would those policies on Medicaid, unemployment insurance, the Earned Income Tax Credit, and public schools be passed by a more representative legislature? I don't think so. So this is a call to arms for all those good people, regardless of race or party or age or status, to come to the defense of the Old North State. This is an appeal to our better angels. The rest of the world and most states are moving on, trying new ideas, daring to dream, opening their borders and their minds to new citizens. Unless we reverse course soon, we will be swept aside by those more progressive states. Our schools will stagnate, our roads and bridges will crumble, our environment will sour. This is not for me, and I hope it is not for you. Together, we can reverse course, stake out a better tomorrow, grasp time by the forelock, and move boldly into the future. Our past tells us that we have overcome the forces of negativity again. Surely we can do it now. I close and open the floor to questions.